Where do the Russians launder money, and who are their dance partners?
Sir, I'll take that question. The Russians launder money, short answer, all over, but certainly throughout Eastern and Western Europe, through major financial institutions and in major financial capitals, and potentially here in the United States as well.
And to your knowledge, do we have any idea where here in the United States and who they might be working with? Obviously, we are aware of Deutsche Bank being fined money for laundering money.
So not to my knowledge where specifically, but that gets to sort of the primary issue, is that both in the United States and in Europe, as one of my co-witnesses has made clear, there are limits to how much information we can obtain regarding beneficial ownership information about the true identity of individuals behind companies, and that obscures both our ability within law enforcement and intelligence, but also private sector financial institutions' efforts and ability to really dig deep and figure out who these individuals behind these companies are and where they're located.
So they're laundering to escape sanctions principally, and taxes, we assume?
I think it's a whole range of financial crimes. To Mr. Hall's point from earlier, it's not just sanctions evasion, it's laundering for tax evasion, it's laundering for other types of illicit finance, for human trafficking, kind of across the board.
Yes, sir.
Just if I could add to that, Cyprus, of course, is one of the countries that Russia uses for money laundering. But the UK and the United States are probably close to the top of the list as well because of the things that my colleagues have talked about. I just wanted to underscore it. Anonymous companies, we allow that here, and that's a vehicle for laundering money. Purchase of property can be done without transparency. That's another way. And then because of client privilege relations, law firms are also one of the vehicles. So as a recommendation, I just want to underscore something Heather said earlier, actually Eric as well. Very concretely, if you want to fight what the oligarchs do abroad, more transparency is the right thing, is a very important part of that. The second thing I want to emphasize, however, is that not all of the money coming out of Russia is controlled by Putin. I think that's really important for people to understand. A lot of it is money that is afraid of Putin. They don't want their money to be stolen. They don't want their money to be confiscated by the Kremlin, and so they are also part of the group that are moving their money from Russia to places in the West.
Thank you. My time is more than expired.
Thank you, Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. One thing I do want to say from the outset, as somebody who's in his first elected office, not my first term, but my first elected office. I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon. It was not illegal for me to continue seeing patients and operating on them while I was a candidate. But things changed once I became a candidate and there were different rules. I became a member of Congress and there were different rules. Just want to say that for the record. And Ambassador Mcfaul, I appreciate you talking about the, I call it the instruments of Putinism, if you will. I think that it's what we do need to address. And I want to talk about that in a minute. But I also, we've had morality defined to us today. And frankly, I consider entrapment to be immoral, especially if it's being done by Russians. I think it's immoral for a campaign or a party to which many of our members here have donated to pay a British agent and Russians. Let me point that out. Russians were involved with the dossier to create an unverified, salacious document against the opposing candidate. Okay? Now, I doubt that Putin was unaware that Russians took part in that. That's well documented. But I'm surprised to see the legs that took. Putin probably never imagined, or maybe he did, that the FBI, the DOJ, possibly the CIA, would focus on the American candidate and their campaign rather than the Russian involvement with this entire thing. To the point of surveillance of the campaign, running people into the campaign, and in my opinion, to try and entrap innocent people from that campaign. We even saw an attempted entrapment on the chairman by some comedians. But with all of this, I'm sure that Mr. Putin looks on with glee as we now have a nation so divided, polarized, as was said here today, It's beyond my belief. And they've gotten away with it. I said in this committee 2 years ago, as the fighting began, which was not there my first term on this committee, by the way, until Mr. Trump won. As the fighting began, I said the Russians are getting everything they want right now. And we have not had discussions of FISA abuses this term. We've not had discussions on the unmasking processes that take place, all of which have raised serious concerns about what is taking place here. We also haven't had discussions on Russian involvement with the dossier. And I don't know how we get back together as a nation and how we become unpolarized, if we will, if we don't address the truth and have true justice and America know what actually took place. So I'm disappointed, as you might imagine, to see all this focus and none on the Russians themselves as they were involved with that entire process from the beginning as having helped to write that dossier. And if Putin was for Trump, what has happened to the Russians that tried to take him down? You've been very eloquent about the power of this man. So I would like to hear anybody would like to comment on the Russian involvement with this whole process from the beginning as being involved with the dossier.
I mean, I could try to speak to that. You're referring to the Steele dossier. I am not aware of, and again, I've been out of service for a number of years now, but I'm not aware of direct Russian involvement in the dossier. I don't rule it out. I'm simply not aware of it.
Well, that's how it's been reported, but we haven't seen anything coming from within ourselves to say yes or no. We're investigating it. Yet that's what's been reported. And let me tell you, we've gone down a lot of paths because of things that were reported that weren't necessarily true. But shouldn't we be trying to look into that? Let me just have your opinion. Does that not, if that's true, doesn't it disturb you?
I think it's absolutely important.
Mr. Mcfaul, you're shaking your head yes, so I'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely, sir. I have a lot of questions about what the Russians did in 2016 that haven't been answered. That's why I want to read Mr. Mueller's report. I used to work with him. He's a thorough guy. I look forward to reading that. I think we have to know what happened. We have to do the diagnostics properly. And just let me say two things, because you asked for my opinion, so that's why I woke up, okay? I'm not an expert on what happened, but two things I feel really strongly about. National security is not a partisan issue. I worked for the National Security Council. I didn't work for the Democratic Security Council. And I took an oath of office to the United States of America when I became the U.S. ambassador. And there are other issues that are done in partisan ways, right? Tax policy benefits some and others, and we can debate about that. You all debate about that. But when it comes to national security, if the Russians attack us, they're not going to just attack the Republicans and leave the Democrats to the side. They're not going to do that. And I hope, I'm sorry to get emotional, but I want us to get back to the national security threats that threaten all of us together.
Thank you. I appreciate that. When I joined the military under a president I didn't vote for, because I put that first. That was my commander-in-chief. I took an oath to defend the United States of America. I couldn't agree with you more, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Chairman. And Chairman, I support you holding this hearing and the work you've done to address the threats from the outside as well as from the inside. And first, I just want to ask, yes or no, is it the judgment of each witness that Russia intends to attack and interfere in our democracy again this upcoming 2020 election? Ms. Connelly.
They will not stop. They will continue.
Ambassador Mcfaul.
I don't know. I know they have the capacity to do everything they did in 2016. And we as a country on multiple planes, and I'm happy to walk through all of them if we have time, have done next to nothing to protect ourselves. That doesn't mean that they'll use that capacity. I think it'll depend on the situation in 2020. But will they look at the United States? Will Putin look at the United States as his principal enemy in the world and do things to reduce our capacity to do things in the world? The answer to that is yes.
Thank you. Mr. Hall.
Yes, I believe they will.
And Mr. Launder.
I don't know, but if past is prologue, as evidenced in the 2016 and the 2018 elections, I have serious concerns that they will try.
Thank you. Ms. Connelly, what is the objective of sanctions against Russia?
The objective is to change Russia's behavior and its violations of international law, whether that's the illegal annexation of Crimea, the seizure of territory in eastern Ukraine. It's to punish them for the use of chemical weapons on NATO territory. It is to change behavior. Unfortunately, we've not seen a change of behavior. If anything, we've seen a doubling down of aggressive behavior.
Ambassador Mcfaul, have the various sanctions affected the Russia economy over the years?
Yes. There are different estimates. I go through different estimates in my written testimony. One estimate is 1.5% of GDP was lost in 2014. Another one by the World Bank puts it more at 2.5%. Bloomberg Economics put it at 6% since 2014. And that's on the aggregate, Congressman. Remember, on the individuals, they also have an effect. Putin himself has said on the record that it violates the human rights of some of those individuals. These are his close personal friends, so they definitely are having an impact. And I want to add two things, if I may, to what Heather already said. The goal for us, of course, is to change Putin's behavior. That is what sanctions are put in place for. But there's another thing I think that's important. Sometimes you just have to do the right thing, even if you know you're not going to change that behavior. So think of the counterfactual. Russia annexes territory in Crimea, and we do nothing. That will then create, I think, permissive conditions for him to do more. So remember that, even if you're not seeing change in behavior. Also remember, Putin very rationally wants to lift sanctions. If I were the president of Russia, I would want to lift sanctions on my close friends and to reduce that burden on the Russian economy. There's nothing spectacular about that.
Are they worthy of having sanctions lifted?
Am I worried?
Are they worthy?
Oh,
of
no,
having sanctions?
no. But what I wanted to say is, rather than changing his behavior, he's waiting for governments to change. That's a very different strategy, right? In Europe and here in the United States, that's what he's been waiting for. And in my opinion, that would be a cataclysmic mistake to lift sanctions just in the name of getting along with Putin. You can't do that until he's changed his behavior.
I've long thought, or I first thought after the interference campaign, that the reason that the Russians sought to help Donald Trump, as our intelligence committee assessed, was that transactionally they wanted to get a benefit. They wanted to see the reduction of NATO's influence, a candidate who talked about doing that. They wanted a candidate who would reduce sanctions. They wanted a candidate who would look the other way on what they've done in Crimea. But the more I've learned through many of you and others on Russia's intentions is that what they really sought to do was to tear down the idea of America, this idea that no matter who you are, where you're from, what your parents did, who you love, that if you work hard enough, you can be anything. And if that's true in our young country, it could be true anywhere, including in Russia. And the best way to keep Russians from asking for that fair shot, that democracy, free markets, free ideas, a freedom to dream, is to destroy it at its origin, and that was the bigger goal that they had. Would you agree with that, Ambassador?
I think both can be true. So most certainly the second piece, and that is part of their focus, and that's been the focus of Putin well before the 2016 election. He's just using new means to get at that, at what you described. The second is also true. You don't need to believe me. Vladimir Putin said it at the Helsinki summit, at the press conference. He said, I wanted Trump to win. And by the way, that's very rational if you're Putin because of what candidate Trump said. Now, I want to give the Trump administration credit that all those things that they thought they were going to get, they didn't get. But the second category, I think they feel pretty good that they're receiving returns on their investment in the second category you described.
And I only point that out because we've now learned about Russian investments in the NRA, and when you step back and think about it, they don't have gun rights in Russia, so it's not like they're advancing some principle they believe in at home, but it's to really stoke a culture war, again, tearing down the idea of America. And I'll yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you all. I'm familiar with not all of you, but several of you I am in your long years of service, and I thank you for that service and for being here today. And I do have a list of questions for you, which I'll get to in a moment. But before I do, I feel like I have to address at least briefly the elephant in the room, and to, as a kind of man-to-man, explain to our chairman why I signed this letter today. I consider myself a fairly soft-spoken person. I don't like conflict. I don't seek after conflict. But again, I think that this deserves an explanation, and that is that the chairman of the Select Intelligence Committee is not just another politician. It's not just someone who is a member of the resistance and may disagree with this president. This individual is in a position of great responsibility and special trust. And that trust can be destroyed if accusations are made without evidence. Last weekend, the Attorney General and Mr. Mueller released their report and a synopsis of those reports. And now, this is important to make, that some have said that he concluded there wasn't sufficient legal threshold was reached to prove conspiracy or collusion, but that's simply not true. He didn't say we saw evidence, but it wasn't sufficient to reach a legal threshold to prosecute. He said we saw no evidence of collusion. And he even added, despite multiple attempts by the Russians to make contact with the campaign, the House Intelligence Committee found this, the Senate Intelligence Committee has indicated they have found no evidence of collusion. Mr. Mueller found evidence or no evidence of collusion. And yet, just a few days ago, Chairman, you said, undoubtedly there is collusion. And I think it's important to note that I would substitute collusion with treason, because you're not accusing someone of getting a parking ticket or stealing a piece of bubblegum. You are accusing the president of treason, of working with a foreign government and not an ally, not an unknown government entity, a long-time known adversary, and you are saying he has committed high crimes. He is subverting our own law. He is trying to steal an election. He is destroying the trust of the electoral process and break down faith in democracy. And I don't think you can make that accusation and at the same time say, but we're not going to call for his impeachment. I don't think you can have it both ways. If you truly believe that, I don't know how you could not rise today and say, and he should be impeached, and I will lead efforts to impeach him. Because you can't say that he has committed treason and say, but we're okay with that. To use your phrase, Mr. Chairman, we're okay with that. We'll allow him to stay in office. It has to be one or the other. And that's why I signed this letter today. Now, to the witnesses, I'd like to ask you a series of questions, if I could, in the few minutes I have left, and just answer yes or no. I think they really are yes or no questions. Do you think that the president's efforts to pressure NATO to comply with their long-held commitments of spending 2% of their GDP on military and on readiness? I was a former Air Force pilot. I remember flying with NATO pilots, loved those guys. They wanted to be in the fight, but they didn't have the capabilities that we needed them to have because their politicians and policymakers had not committed to spending the money that they said they would. Do you think that pressuring NATO to fulfill that commitment is an important tool to countering Russia's influence in Europe? Ms. Connelly?
Congressman, pressing our European allies to spend more on defense has been the policy of the United States government for well over 40 decades, and we must continue it. But we cannot use this pressure to break the alliance. And what the president has done is used an important tool to get them to spend more, and now created a real division in the alliance, and the fact that many of our allies are not entirely sure America is faithful in its credibility in that alliance. So the objective is right. The tactics, however, are defeating the
I completely disagree with you. I don't think that it was the president's intention at all to weaken the alliance. We are simply asking them to do what they've committed to do. And they'll either do that or they won't. If they won't, then they're not a true member of the alliance. And I think that's a fair thing for him to do. Does anyone disagree that committing and pressuring NATO to increase their defense spending helps to counter Russian influence? None of you disagree with that, surely. Let me give another couple examples in a few seconds. Kinetic weapons to the Ukraine. The European Reassurance Initiative, something I think is incredibly important, pressuring our European allies not to rely on Russia for their energy needs. In fact, domestic energy policy that provides an increased world supply and drives down the price of global energy. I think every one of those are important policy decisions which help to counter Russia's influence globally and in Europe. Do any of you disagree with that? Okay, thank you. And
Can I address that?
yes.
I think
my time is up. It's up to the chairman if he'll allow, but.
Yes, you may respond.
I think that everything that we've just talked about with regard to NATO and NATO members paying and so forth, interpreted in this room and in a Western context, is completely understandable, and as Heather indicated, has been policy. The Russians don't see it that way. Vladimir Putin sees that as a split. He sees that as weakening the NATO alliance and weakening our Western
Well, then he's simply mistaken. He can
may be,
interpret
but that's
however
what
he wants,
he
but
may be,
he's
but that's
mistaken
what
if that's
ISS
how he
believes.
views it. Yeah, thank you.
Before I recognize Mr. Heck, I do want to comment on something you said, Mr. Stewart, because I think it fundamentally misconceives what the Mueller report is and indeed what the Barr summary is. The Barr summary, which is all we have right now, doesn't say they found no evidence of collusion. That's simply not true. And that is repeated over and over again, so people think that's true, but that's not what the Barr letter says. What the Barr letter says is that Mueller could not establish a criminal conspiracy. That's something you would have to establish beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't mean there's not evidence. There is. And that's the fundamental difference here. And as I've said, Mr. Stewart, time and time again, and you can look in the public record because I've said this as a mantra dozens of times over the last year, that I think that these interactions with the Russians that I enumerated earlier are evidence of corruption. They're evidence of collusion, rather. But that whether that amounts to proof beyond reasonable doubt of a crime, the crime of conspiracy, I've always said is a different question that Bob Mueller would have to decide. And he's decided that question. And I respect it. And I said that I would respect his judgment. But that's what I've said. And I think that the letter fundamentally misconceives that. Mr. Heck.
Well, would the chairman allow me to respond?
Yes.
And I'll do so just quickly. We're going to have to agree to disagree on the verbiage. And I think you're making a distinction without a difference in the sense that you have never, and to my knowledge, added that caveat. You have said, I see evidence of collusion. You didn't add that would reach a legal threshold. And we can find evidence of all sorts of things, but if it doesn't reach a legal threshold, then it's meaningless. And again, Mr. Chairman, we could have this conversation, but we'll agree to disagree, and I'll concede my time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I just briefly be recognized for a procedural point? May I
Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I enter into the record a PolitiFact finding from PolitiFact that you indeed did every time that you brought up the question of collusion, characterize it as a difference between a proof beyond a reasonable doubt finding by a prosecutor, but that there was evidence, and that's a March 25, 2019 PolitiFact story, What Democrats Said About Trump, Collusion Before Mueller Report. I'd like to enter that into the record.
And for clarification, would you share part of what it says?
Mr. Chairman, point of order, are we introducing PolitiFact information into this testimony hearing?
Yes, Mr. Crawford, I am.
Without objection.
I object to that.
Mr. Swalwell, you may be recognized.
Thank you. The article says Republicans have been having a field day rubbing the Democrats' noses in the outcome of Special Counsel Mueller's report. As the summary from the Attorney General William Barr quoted Mueller's report, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. It goes on to characterize your statements, Mr. Chairman. It says, as the top Democrat and current chair of HIPSI, Adam Schiff has been a point man for the Democrats throughout the investigation. And it quotes you as saying a number of times, including about a year after January 10, 2018, you said, there's clear evidence of the issue of collusion. But whether it amounts to conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, I think we will still have to wait for Bob Mueller's work. Schiff tweeted similar comments after Barr's letter was released, March 24. Schiff wrote, Mueller did not find sufficient evidence to establish conspiracy, notwithstanding Russian offers to help the Trump campaign, their acceptance, and a litany of concealed interactions with Russia. I trust Mueller's prosecutorial judgment, but the country must see the evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. I've just mentioned you could find literally dozens of times where I made the same observations over the last year and a half. Mr. Heck, you're recognized.
And I'd ask to put that into the record.
It will be made a part of the record. Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to be added to the list of those who also want to actually see Director Mueller's work product. I've, consistent with what the chair has asserted over the last year and a half, placed a great deal of confidence in him, and there's nothing about that confidence that's been changed or amended in any way by the developments of the last week. I'm more than bothered by the fact that there seems to be a subtle but nonetheless real campaign to foot drag on the release of this material. My mother always taught me consider the source, and so when it does come to the 4-page letter from the appointed Attorney General, who last summer submitted a 19-page single-space unsolicited argument that there was no basis for proceeding with obstruction of justice angle, for example, I do want to read the Mueller report. And I want to consider as well that which we seem to forget, because this is a evolving set of periodic amnesia, it seems to me. The original assertion for quite some time by the administration was there's no interference whatsoever in the election. None. And then when the weight of the unanimous opinion of the intelligence community came to full effect, then it was, well, yeah, there may have been interference, but they didn't really favor either candidate. And then that fell by the wayside. And then it was no collusion. And of course, we are where we are on the definition of these terms. Earlier today, there were repeated references to McCarthy hearings and Joseph McCarthy. I don't know, maybe it's because I sit next to my good friend from Vermont that I'm reminded of the other Joseph Welch, who famously said, "At long last have you left no sense of decency." Asked and answered. Ms. Connelly, so grateful to you for your reference earlier about the importance of Congress continuing to emphasize that Nord Stream 2 is not in Europe's best long-term interest. Thank you for getting that characterization on the record. I would appreciate it, however, if you were comfortable associating some qualitative measure of that. We have a lot of risk that we have to assess that confront our NATO allies and confront us directly or indirectly. How serious of a threat to Europe's long-term interest and ours is the completion of Nord Stream 2, in your opinion?
Congressman, it's quite serious, but I would add it's also equally as serious as a pipeline called Turkstream that is will increase dependency of Southern Europe on Russian gas. We have to see this in the totality. I believe we should do everything in our power to convince our European partners that this is not in their interest. We are in a very fragile moment with our alliances. Alliances are America's greatest strength. And our adversaries know that, and that's why, in fact, Vladimir Putin's trying to break those alliances, because that is our strength. We have to work this very difficult issue, but maintain alliance unity. And that's been very difficult to do for previous administrations as well as for this administration. But it's very important that Europe breaks the dependency on Russian energy. There's EU law that provides for that, but they have to follow that law. We have to keep working very hard to prevent this from happening.
Do the Russians financially incentivize the Germans to play along? You or Ambassador?
Well, I would just say what we're seeing again across Europe are deep, deep economic relationships that have been there for decades. These are difficult relationships to break. These economic relationships have great political support and patronage across the political spectrum in these countries. It is very difficult.
Do the Russians financially incentivize the Germans?
Well, of course they do. This is
and
part
individuals?
Well, banks, and there are very notable individuals like former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder that is a part of this, and we see this repeating itself in other countries as well.
Have the sanctions on Gazprom had any effect in this regard?
In terms of causing specific transactional pain to Gazprom, the answer is likely yes. I don't have the figures directly in front of me.
Sufficient to deter the completion of Nord Stream 2?
At the current time, I don't think so, no.
I see I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heck. Mr. Crawford.
Mr. Chairman, before I'm recognized, I have a parliamentary inquiry. I believe a gentleman from California asked unanimous consent to enter that into the record, and by definition, that would require unanimity. I objected, and yet you ignored that objection.
Mr. Crawford, would you like to take a vote on entering a PolitiFact record into the record? We made an objection to the partisan letter from you and your colleagues entering into the
All right,
record.
okay, well, that's fine. I have a list of quotes here I would like to submit for the record. I can read them all, or I can just submit it for the record if you'd like.
You're more than welcome to submit them for the
I'll
record.
submit those for the record, and now I'll claim my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, 1990 was the first McDonald's franchise was opened in Moscow, and you spent a lot of time there in Moscow as an ambassador.
I ate at that McDonald's in 1990 many times.
And there have been, I'm sure, several opened since then in that area. In 2007, Starbucks opened their first store. Starbucks is not a franchise, it's company-owned. So I raise that point to just illustrate the difference between franchise and a company-owned store. So certainly there's some different considerations there, wouldn't you agree?
I'm not an expert on these companies, but that's true, and I would remind you that the McDonald's that opened in 1990, if my memory serves me right, I want to be careful, that I think it was a Canadian enterprise, not an American one.
Okay. Have there been any American franchises opened up other brands since that 1990 timeframe that you're aware of?
Sir, because Congressman Nunes reminded me, I'm on the record, I want to be careful. I do not know. I did not do that research before coming here. My guess would be absolutely yes. There's several hundred of them.
You know, the world's just gotten so much smaller, and there's business,
Yeah.
American-owned businesses all over the globe, and whether
Right.
they're franchised, whether they're company-owned. So in 2007, Starbucks goes into Moscow, and I'm sure there's been several Starbucks locations since then. And now we have a presidential candidate, Howard Schultz. Do you think he should come under the same scrutiny? Do you think there's any potential collusion there? Do you think he might be compromised because he's done business there and opening up Starbucks stores in Russia?
Sir, I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a great question. What I would say is, because I don't know what the business transactions were to open those Starbucks. I want to be clear about that.
Well, a little
I know
bit ago,
I know generally that it is difficult. I know generally that there's sometimes compromising things that have to happen, but I don't know that with the specific case of Starbucks. The second thing I would say is we should just call for transparency about that. And so you actually know that those Starbucks are there. And I think for all presidential candidates, we should know of all their business relations abroad. I think that's in the America's national interest.
Okay, so I hope that comes to light. I certainly wouldn't want to see a presidential candidate that's not thoroughly vetted with regard to international business, given the context of what we've seen over the last couple of years.
I
Right?
couldn't agree more. And one of the ways to know that is to have people publish their taxes. That's how we know that.
We're not going to settle that in this committee.
I understand, but that's a really great way to have transparency about what you do financially abroad.
Okay, and something else you mentioned in your opening comments, you mentioned that the Russians influenced the 2016 election. That's an assessment I'm not sure you can make. I'm sure they attempted to influence, but that is entirely subjective, the degree to which they were influencing American voters. Isn't that fair to say?
Here's the way I would characterize it, and there's been many great academic studies. I cite many of them in the footnotes in my written testimony about this. Here's my personal assessment of that academic research, okay? Number one, just to remind everybody, there was a multi-pronged effort by the Kremlin to influence the outcome of our 2016 presidential election. Not just one thing, but many, many things that happened. Number two, they had clear preferences in that race. When Sputnik International tweets #Crooked Hillary, it's you don't need a PhD in Russian studies to figure out what they're trying to do there. And number three, now I want to put my political science hat on, which I've spent most of my life as a political scientist and not as a government official. I don't think one can isolate the independent causal influence of the Russian factor set against all the other factors that influence votes in the 2016 presidential election. So I'm not prepared to say that, unlike other people who have said that.
Let me pause just in the brief time I have left. It's been probably less than 2 years ago, former CIA Director Brennan said before this committee that the Russians had been engaged in active measures to seek to influence elections in the United States for decades. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I think what happened in 2016 was qualitatively different than any action of influence that
But
the
is that
Soviets did.
attributable to the media they have available, or is it attributable to something else? Because
Multiple-
we didn't have Twitter and Facebook back in the 1990s.
That's right. So that's different. We did have it in 2012. They didn't use it then. But without question, for me and my assessment, and this is my assessment, I want to emphasize, the most important thing they did was not that. It was the doxing. It was the stealing of American property from individuals and then publishing that. That's something that they had capabilities to do before and chose not to do it. So I think it is true this has always been their way. And by the way, I want to emphasize, it's not just the United States of America that is a target of these operations. It's all in other places. Watch what happens in Ukraine shortly. But I think 2016 was a qualitatively different operation than previous elections.
Thank you. My time's expired. I appreciate the amplification on the fact that they've been involved in other countries besides the United States. Thank you.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much. This is a really extraordinary panel, and I'm struck with the clarity and the consensus among the four of you about the threat that Russia poses. Mr. Mcfaul, or Ambassador Mcfaul, your opening statement was chilling in a way. The contest is now between, as you quote you, autocracy, corruption, state domination of the economy, and indifference to international norms versus democracy, rule of law, free markets, and respect for international law. And I take it there's a consensus among you about that characterization. And Professor Connelly, what you also said, I thought was very, very powerful about this is about a strategy of influence, not force, and it exploits any societal weaknesses in divisions that we have, and they can get in your head. And Ambassador, what you were just describing, which is qualitatively different, is what is chilling to me. And I'll say this, as a member of Congress, until I was on and watched this, I was not as aware of the depth and aggression that has been behind this until I am now becoming a student of it. And I say that because I think that suggests that everyday citizens who are trying to figure out how to get through their day, get their kids to daycare, this is not forefront on their mind. So aside from this question that is the political debate that we're having, is it essential for our security that we have a consensus in the American body politic about what a dangerous adversary and determined adversary Russia is to our democratic values? I'll start with you, Ambassador.
The answer to that is yes. And let me say a couple of things, if I may. Number one, it was raised earlier, I think somebody was quoting Mike Morrell, that this was the political equivalent of September 11th. I believe that's the right way to frame it. It was a violation of our sovereignty in 2016. But unlike 9/11, we didn't have a bipartisan commission that investigated what happened. By the way, investigated what the Bush administration did. I'm a former member of the Obama administration. I think that should have been interrogated too. We didn't do that, and we haven't even got to the prescriptive part. So I would just, one, associate with that. I think that's the right frame. Number two, Putin's a person I have known. I met him first in 1991. I've written about him a lot. We're not exactly Facebook friends. He doesn't like me. I don't like him. But what I would note, as somebody who has watched his career, maybe not quite as long as Steve, but probably close, a couple of things. One, he's aggrieved. He thinks that we have ruined his country. But two, with time, he's gotten way more aggressive, he's taking bigger risks. So annexation, 2014, intervening in Syria, 2015, intervening in our elections in 2016, trying to kill Skripal in 2018, and trying to arrest Americans. Remember, that's what happened in Helsinki. Those are riskier actions, and I just want to make sure we understand the nature of this threat. It's growing, and it's
Right, and
become more
that would
belligerent.
suggest that there has to be, whatever our divisions are in our debates here, there has to be some unity coming from our State Department, from our executive branch, from our Congress, that whatever our divisions are, this is a threat to all of us. Would you speak to that?
Yes,
And you
Congressman
talked
Welch-
about corruption and how that undercuts democracy.
Well,
Please
and
elaborate.
thank you for your question. I do a lot of speaking to groups across the country, world affairs, councils, and things like that. The American people do not understand the totality of the challenge and that it is a strategy that is working inside of us. It is a fight for the integrity of the American mind. I'll give you an example. After the Skripal poisoning, where a chemical agent was used on NATO territory, Russian disinformation provided over 46 different explanations of what that could possibly be. If you're an average citizen trying to figure out who, what, where, how, nothing is true, and then everything becomes possible. That was followed up by the Russian hacking of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to try to alter the results of that. This is what is at stake. During the active measures period in the Cold War, the American people knew who the enemy was.
Right.
There was training and understanding of this. There is none of that, and political polarization
I've only got a
makes it
couple of
worse.
minutes left, but you know, there's arms control treaties in our Defense Department, but what I'm hearing that you're saying is that we, number one, have to build our alliances, and number two, we have to express great clarity about what the threat is. Would you agree with that? Well, I want to thank you. Go ahead. I'm running out of time, but go ahead.
The only thing that's a great line of questioning. Vladimir Putin is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. He does not care. All he cares about is that we become divided and split, and he will continue to work in unprecedented fashions, to allude to an earlier question.
Right.
I agree with Mike. What happened in 2016 and what I think we can expect to happen in the future in terms of their active measures, their hybrid warfare, is indeed unprecedented. And there's going to be more 9/11s from Russia, in short, and we got to figure out a way to deal with that.
Well, thank you. And before I yield back, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I'd be interested in us taking up some of the suggestions that Mr. Launder made about the illegal moving of money. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, not just for being here today, but for your long careers of commitment to this country. Ambassador Mcfaul, our foreign service oftentimes gets dragged into the mud, and they're doing incredible things in hard places, and most people don't understand what it's like to be targeted by the Russians the way you do. So thank you for that. And Mr. Hall, our colleagues that have to deal in denied areas and work in tough places against an insurmountable foe. Most people can't understand that, nor will they ever understand that. You do, and thank you for bringing your attention to this. And Mr. Launder and Ms. Connelly, thank you for the unsexy work of getting into the details about some of these issues that help inform folks like us. And while I do have a question, I must associate myself with the gentleman from Texas and his letter. Prior to the 2016 election, I was calling for Ambassador Kislyak to be PNG'd from this country. Prior to the 2016 election, I was trying to say how this sustained covert influence operation by the Russians had to be addressed. Grisly step, what the intelligence community refers to the attempts by the Russian government to influence our election, is going to go down in history as the Russian intelligence greatest covert influence operation. Why? Because their goal, and Mr. Hall, you alluded to this, is to erode trust in our democratic institutions. It is to erode trust in the American people and the intelligence services, to erode trust between the intelligence services and the legislative branch. Its goal is to erode trust between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And I've sat here for 22 months and having many of my colleagues question our side of the aisle's commitment and understanding that the Russians is a threat. It's clear, Republicans and Democrats on this committee agree the Russians attempted to influence our election. They tried to do it in 18, they're going to try to do it in 20, they're doing it in Moldova, they've done it in Armenia, they're going to continue to do that. And so when we question that, when we imply that there is not an agreement on that particular issue, we are falling into the trap of eroding trust in our institutions. And we have to change our behavior. We have to get at this threat because they are continuing to do it, and they're very good, and we're not prepared for that. And Mr. Hall, my question for you, who is responsible for counter covert influence? And who should be responsible for that in the U.S. government?
I think given how the Russians have evolved in terms of their capabilities, their hybrid warfare, their influence operations, all of those different disciplines, I believe that it actually now in the United States needs to be an all-of-government approach if such a thing is possible. Obviously, we need to have certain folks taking the leads. The intelligence community has to inform what's going on. There's a military component to it because I think we need to protect critical infrastructure. But it touches, the way that the Russians are doing it now, it touches so many different parts of our government and indeed our society that it's got to be a widespread thing. So unfortunately, I don't know that I can name one person, one agency, one organization to do it. It's too broad now.
Thank you. Ambassador Mcfaul.
All of that said, I also want to make sure, in my view, we understand that the answer to your question is not just an intel question, it's a policy question.
For sure.
The President of the United States needs to stand next to Vladimir Putin and say, we know what you did in 2016, and if you do it again, these are going to be the consequences. And until the President of the United States doesn't do that, it's not good enough for the rest of the Trump administration to try to do that. I know a lot of those people. I think they've got a pretty good policy towards Russia. I actually do. And in some of the things, they were better than us in terms of our policy in the Obama administration. But when the President of the United States, standing right next to him in Helsinki, sides with Putin and not your former colleagues, that does the very damage that you just described about trust in our
Mr.
institutions.
McFaul, I've made my opinions on this topic very clear. But what I will end with, before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I left a job as an undercover officer in the CIA because I was disgusted with the things I had to do and the lack of knowledge that congressional leaders had, and when I had to brief them when I was overseas. I felt that there were people in Congress at that time that were going against the opposite of what my friends and my colleagues were doing, not just in the CIA, but in the military, in our foreign service, and I was disgusted with that, and I said, I gotta try to do something about it. And it's great to be able to help the intelligence community in a different way by serving on this committee. But what we need to do is stop with the innuendo, stop with abusing our position and implying we have access to something that we do not have access. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would only mention that to my colleague, that in the last session, the majority produced a report that suggested to the American people that the intelligence community's conclusion that Russia had intervened, and in fact intervened to help one candidate and hurt the other, should be subject to doubt. That the intelligence community didn't use the proper tradecraft, that conclusion should be called into question. I don't think that was in the service of the country. I don't think that's reflected in any of the intelligence. I don't think that's going to be reflected in Bob Mueller's report. And that was the unanimous opinion of the then majority. Every member of this panel who was a part of that signed that report. And I fully concur, Mr. Hurd, that we need to be very clear about Russian intervention. We need to all condemn it on a bipartisan basis. We should show no daylight in that. We'll never know whether that intervention was decisive in the election. I've never suggested it was. We don't know, and our intelligence community, though the The president has represented that that's what they concluded. That's not their job, and of course that wasn't their conclusion. It's beyond their role and their capability to predict election outcomes. Ambassador Mcfaul?
Would the gentleman yield to
Yes.
Is it normal within the Directorate of Intelligence, or I guess it's now the Directorate of Analysis, for a senior analyst involved in a subject matter to be excluded from the review of all source intelligence on that subject?
Mr. You and I can carry on this conversation, or we can ask the experts whether they have any reason to question the intelligence community's assessment that the Russians intervened on one side and not the other. Shall we put it to the witnesses?
I doubt they will have the opportunity to speak on classified materials, but I would love to talk about the process on how intelligence has been developed and how all source intelligence should be developed. And again, there is no question about the ICA assessment about the Russians' attempt to influence our elections. But tradecraft, standards of tradecraft are standards of tradecraft. And when there is a deviation from that standard of tradecraft, we should understand why.
Well, Mr. Castro, you are up next, if you'll indulge me. Let me ask the witnesses, does anyone on this panel question the intelligence community's finding that the Russians intervened in our election and did so for the purpose of helping one candidate and hurting the other?
Would the gentleman yield to add an additional question?
I'd like to allow the witnesses to answer. Does anyone question that? Ms. Connelly?
No, I do not question it.
Ambassador?
No
Mr.
question.
Hall? Mr. Lorber? Mr. Castro, you're recognized.
Mr. Castro, would the gentleman yield for 20 seconds, please, sir?
Sure.
I would welcome the gentleman asking the question if any of the panelists knew how the ICA was developed and whether their understanding of the process on which it was vetted through the intelligence agency. And I yield back.
I can give an answer there. I'll let him answer your question, Will.
I have no knowledge of the process.
Neither do I.
I have no direct knowledge, but it would be difficult for me to imagine that the heads of the intelligence organizations would stand up and vouch for it if there were not some integrity to it, but that's speculation on my part.
Likewise, I have no knowledge of the process.
All right. Thank you for y'all's testimony today. I wanted to ask you about sanctions and their effectiveness and whether sanctions in the long term will have an effect on Vladimir Putin's grip on power in Russia and how they're affecting his hold on power in Russia.
Congressman, I'm probably on the pessimistic side of our sanctions regime, as important it is to continue to place those sanctions. I think in many ways, President Putin has used these sanctions as a method of weeding out those that are not loyal to him and more loyal to their bank accounts in the West. He has renationalized important parts of his economy. What he recently announced, and which was met with some fairly significant protests in Russia, he's unplugging from the international system because he understands it's the vulnerability. So the online Iron Curtain, he's removing himself from the online because he knows we have a cyber offensive capability that during the midterm elections we shut down the Internet Research Agency and other things. They are trying to develop now, we're seeing this across the board, the exhaustion of sanctions, that they're creating a separate financial system so that if, the most extreme option, if we were to eliminate them from the international financial transaction system, the SWIFT system, that they would have additional resources to be able to withstand that. So there is a system to prevent the sanctions from impacting them completely, and I think this is where what we are suggesting in our report, what Eric has been suggesting, is we now need a new set of tools to actually prevent Russian money laundering, illicit financing from being housed and sheltered in our systems. And that could be a very, very robust way of responding to Russian aggression in its many forms.
Can I?
Sure, Ambassador.
you mind if I build on Heather's comments? Because I think there is a risk of what I term sanctions atrophy in two ways. One, to Heather's point about evasion techniques, the Russians are very good about using front and shell companies, and they're only getting better. So as she said, that in the last 2 years, you've seen significant innovation. The other issue, which I think is important to flag in terms of the long-term consequences and long-term impact of these tools, in Russia in particular, is that the longer that the European Union maintains its sanctions program, the less likely that over time they're going to renew. The way the EU sanctions work is that there is a 6-month period, and at the end of that 6 months, they have to renew these sanctions, the sectoral sanctions they have in place. As time goes on, and as the sanctions don't seem to be having a significant impact and change in Russian behavior, you're hearing increasing calls from particular EU member states to not renew. And because it's a unanimous decision that's required in the EU, if there is the opportunity to peel off 1 or 2 significant European countries, you could see a significant fracturing of the transatlantic unity on the sanctions regime.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Just a couple of comments. I think it's wrong to assume because Putin hasn't changed his behavior that Russians support the sanctions and support Putin. Individuals, I know many of the people many of the people on the sanctions list. I have to see them in third countries now, as I already talked about, because I'm on the sanctions list. But I think it's important to understand that there's a real division among them about the wisdom of the belligerent behavior that Putin did and that they're suffering for it. They'll tell you that privately, but for all the reasons we've been discussing for the last couple hours, they would never do that publicly. But remember, that sentiment is there among the elites. Number 2, polling data in Russia is flawed. Most of the polling companies are controlled by the government, and remember, it's a heavily surveilled country. So when you're sitting out in Novosibirsk and Ivan Ivanovich calls you from Moscow and he says, hey, what do you think of Putin? There's only one rational answer to that, right? You support him. That said, even with that flawed data, his numbers are going down. The rallying around the flag effect of the war in Ukraine and calling us the enemy because of sanctions, that is dissipating. And in Russia, they talk about it, the divide between, the fight between the television, which is the propaganda, and the refrigerator. And I would never be so unwise as to try to predict when that moves in a way that changes his behavior, but the numbers are moving in this way, and there's a real despondency, both among elites and growing in society, about this period of stagnation that Russia is in.
Thanks. Are you back?
Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your dignity and strength in the face of some truly ridiculous remarks that were made this morning. And I think it's ironic that our colleagues on the other side bristled at the notion that they didn't care as much about Russian influence in our elections, or malign influence generally, and yet not a single one of them remains to join the conversation with some of the leading experts in the world. I think that speaks volumes. And I also think that if their position is that the improper, unethical, and unpatriotic conduct of the president wasn't criminal, and that therefore is some cause for celebration, well, I just have a very different view of it, and I, for one, appreciate very much the temerity you've shown to ask some questions about that in your role as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Gentlemen, and Ms. Connelly, thank you so much for your appearance here today. We really do value your expertise. We depend on it. Thank you for your service. My question is to Ambassador Mcfaul, but anyone should feel free to answer it. You spoke earlier about the prescriptive measures that we should be taking. What would those look like? If you were advising the president today and that president was going to follow that advice, what were the top 2 or 3 things you said we are not doing now that we should be doing?
Thanks for the question. We'll have a big report with a group of Stanford colleagues coming out shortly, and I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of it. We briefly summarized it in a piece in the Washington Post, which I'll make sure everybody gets. It was published yesterday with one of your members, by the way, Ro Khanna, and my colleague Alex Stamos, who used to be the head of security at Facebook. Let me just go through a couple of the things, starting with the most important, cybersecurity infrastructure for our electoral infrastructure. We've done some measures, but not nearly enough in order to make sure that the votes that are cast are the ones that we are able to count. And even on the voting rolls, by the way, remember, Russia doesn't have to do, and I don't want to say Russia, Putin, because it's not all Russia. And by the way, not all Russians let me just add a footnote to something I said earlier. I want to correct the record. I think it's very important to remember that not all Russians are corrupt. There are many Russians doing legitimate business with Americans, and we need to be careful to be precise when we're talking about that, because I was not precise earlier. So, but back to this, Putin doesn't need to steal 78,000 votes, right? All he needs is for a few thousand people to show up to vote and their name's not on the roll, and then there's camera crews and there's what's going on. That will undermine the integrity of the election, and we have done very little on that. Number two, basic cyber hygiene for people that work on campaigns. I don't want to put people on the spot, but there are very, very simple things one can do. Dual authentication is the most basic, that are not required by law or even norms. That's an easy thing that we should do. Number three, de-amplifying what happens on the social media platforms of these campaigns. Now, notice I didn't say ban them. I think that's a much more difficult thing. But I interact with all those companies in the Silicon Valley, and I think there are ways that they can de-amplify when they expose those things. But then the number 3 or 4 that I'm on, one of the things they would say if they were here is we didn't know about the activity on our platforms because there was not enough coordination between the intelligence community and the private sector. And I think setting up that coordination, maybe with third parties involved to make sure there's no conflict of interest, that would be another thing to do. Another really big debate we have to have is what is the norms of allowing foreign governments to participate in our electoral procedures. You know, I said earlier, Sputnik International, completely controlled by the Kremlin, tweets out #CrookedHillary. That's obviously trying to influence a campaign. What do we do to prevent that kind of activity? I could go on, but I'll
those are very helpful. But I guess I'd invite you, and the others should feel free to join in terms of more significant responses by the U.S. government. I mean, those are prophylactic measures that make a lot of sense to me. But should we have a red line on cyber attacks in this country? Should we make it very clear that if a bomb went off at the DNC and the Russians did it, they would expect a response, and if they engage in this kind of activity, that they should expect a response? And what could that look like if we were truly committed to bloodying their nose so they didn't do it again?
So my brief answer, I'll let my colleagues jump in. The answer to that is yes, that's deterrence. There may have been more of that in 2016 than we know on the record, by the way, because the Obama administration was very focused on Election Day. What would the contours be? I want to be careful about commenting on the record about that. In many ways, it's important to have that conversation off the record with the Russians. But you can't have it if you're not acknowledging that the Russians did it in the first place. And I think the first step would be for the President of the United States to acknowledge on the record what happened and say that there'll be grave consequences and then talk about those consequences privately. One other thing I want to say, just because I have the microphone, I also want more transparency about interactions with Russians and other governments. And we've been focused on Russia rightly, but I want to remind you that there are other actors out there that have an interest in destabilizing and delegitimating our elections. I don't want to ban interaction between Americans and foreigners, including Russians, but I think during campaigns, we should require, either through norms or maybe even legislation, transparency about those interactions.
Congressman, if I just make 3 brief, what we've heard repeatedly, the United States government has to restructure fundamentally for this challenge. We are set up to fight terrorism. We are not set up to fight malign influence, which is perfected by Russian statecraft today. It'll be Beijing statecraft. I mean, this is not going to go away. This is our vulnerability. So there has to be a fundamental restructuring, which includes intelligence, but it also includes the seam between domestic and foreign. That's where this falls into, and that's where we have important laws to prevent and make sure there's a separation, but that's where they're working. We have to inform the American people. Again, to Congressman Welsh's point, we have to talk about this. So Americans are literate and armed with what's going on, so they can read their news feeds in an educated way. They can understand what's going on. And third, and this is what's been missing for quite some time, we have to have an offensive strategy. Once we return our confidence in our democracy and our market economy, to, as what Ronald Reagan said, we have to return to the city on the hill. We want for the Russian people what we want for the Ukrainian people, which is freedom for them to choose their leaders and their way of life, however they wish. We haven't been on offense for a long time. That is what won the Cold War in many ways. We helped solidarity movements. We kept faith with civil society. We told them we stand for something better. That's what's been missing in our strategy.
My time has expired. If the chairman would allow Mr. Hall to respond, that'd be...
Mr. Hall?
Just two brief things. First of all, I agree with everything that Mike and Heather said. We have to make the Russians, and specifically Vladimir Putin, understand that the price that he would pay, that Russia would pay, would be exceedingly high if they attempt something like that again. The details as to how that happens hopefully is already underway in our government, but that's one thing. And the second thing is we've got to do it in coordination with our allies. That amplifies it so much more. It's pretty much that simple. The devil's in the details, but that's what I would recommend.
Thanks. I would say that we need to work to deputize the private sector. And by that I mean there's a lot of focus today on what the intelligence community can do and what law enforcement can do, and those capabilities are tremendous. But one of the greatest force multipliers we have are individuals in financial institutions throughout the world who are looking for this type of illicit activity every day. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people. To the extent that you can provide them with the tools, whether it be legal authorities or obligations to pull information that shows or helps better illustrate where the Russians are hiding assets, how they're attacking our democracy, how they're moving funds, that's incredibly important and will pay significant dividends above and beyond what we already have.
Thank you.
Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being with us today. You know, as a former law enforcement officer and now a member of Congress, I think often about a quote that says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." At the beginning of this hearing, the chairman outlined a list of behaviors that I believe any reasonable person would find inappropriate, especially as it pertains to our national security. That is a #1 concern for me. However, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have lamented over the suggestion that they don't care about those behaviors. Well, as a former police chief, when inappropriate, criminal, unethical behavior was brought to my attention, I did something about it. You don't sit silent and do nothing and work hard to either find a technicality to discredit the witnesses or remind a former ambassador to the United States of America that he's under oath. You don't do that. You work diligently in the pursuit of justice and protecting this country. You hold people accountable who engage in wrongdoing regardless of who they are. And so I'm delighted to be a member of Congress, but disappointed at the direction that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we've got to do this together, chose to take this morning. There is one team for this committee especially, and that's to protect the American team. With that, thank you for allowing me to get that out. It's been painful. Ms. Connelly and Mr. Hall, are there any notable instances of the Kremlin using malign financial influence abroad that have not been discussed yet, that we haven't had the time to discuss? that you would like to?
Well, the report that we've passed out to you, it really dives into at least the use and focusing on concentrated sectors of energy, finance, real estate, how it works, how it metastasizes. This is a shared problem. We focus on Europe, but this is a transatlantic challenge. So I welcome you to read that, and if there's any questions that we can follow up and provide those that have been on the front lines, which are many of our European colleagues that have watched this type of malign influence work within their countries for quite some time. So I'm happy to follow up with you and give you those specific details.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Any in particular?
I have less specifics than I do just in terms of modus operandi. I mean, the Russians do not hesitate, would never hesitate, to use any of their intelligence services to identify individuals and organizations where they see an opportunity to carry out that type of malign activity. It's, again, a different system than we have here. Our intelligence agencies here, for the most part, collect information for policymakers. In Russia, they collect it to do precisely that type of malign activity.
Thank you. Again, Ms. Connelly, is there anything in our financial, legal, or regulatory system that makes the United States particularly vulnerable to tactics used by the Kremlin?
So the one we certainly highlight is the incorporation. We highlight the Netherlands, which is a vast tax incorporation. We could see similarities in the state of Delaware, to be perfectly honest with you. So this is where I said it's not a pointing of fingers, it's a shared issue that we have to greatly heighten transparency on beneficial ownership. I think this is legislation that has been around for quite some time. I hope we give you all the national security imperative to highlight the transparency of beneficial ownership. We also argue in our report that what we need is basically a financial intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance system. And I'm using, technically the terms of warfare. That's how we allow our military to have a common operating picture where they can see the different aspects of it. We need that financially so we can see where the red light is blipping in the Estonian branch and Danske Bank, which is money laundering, which is being, buying real estate, using its malign influence to help fund political parties and other activities to help harm the nation. So we have to create a better common operating picture. This gets back to my concern about we are not structured to do this. Exactly to Eric's point, this has to be a shared public-private partnership. I think the banks and others want help in doing this because the problem is so massive they can't meet that challenge. I think on cyber, the same thing. The technology companies want help, want a partnership to try to combat this malign influence. It's very evasive, and it's going to be very difficult to root out.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may the ambassador.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Just one quick point to underscore something Steve said a couple hours ago that I think is very important analytically, is don't put the Western lens on how Russia works the way that we think about it. So we have some lines of authority and lines of jurisdiction between what Steve used to do and what I used to do, right? Russia doesn't have that. It's all blurred, and there's varying degrees. By the way, the president of Russia is also a former KGB officer, and everything, therefore, is blurred. And just always constantly remind yourself when you're looking to understand what's happening here, it's a very different system, completely dominated these days by the Russian intelligence services.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll associate myself with the comments of Mr. Maloney, and I'm actually glad that Mr. Turner brought Senator McCarthy into the conversation. History will clarify what has happened, and some of the smaller details will be elided, but if my Republican colleagues are betting that the chairman, who is a good friend to all of us and a man of deep, deep integrity, will play the role of Joseph McCarthy in the historical interpretation, rather than a president who regularly calls the press the enemy of the people, who regularly attacks the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, and discredits them when they don't provide information that is consistent with his personal interests, who says there are very fine people on both sides of a Nazi march in Charlottesville. If that's their bet, I will take the other side of that bet. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your your spirited response to outrageous behavior on the part of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. With that, to the panel, thank you for being here. I want to just take a little bit of time to get a little bit more detail around the role that the Russian banks play in this. And I want to quickly just read a quote from a Buzzfeed document dump. It's a letter to Michael Cohen from Felix Saito. And I'm just going to read one line. This is in reference to Trump Tower, and it's not Trump Tower I'm concerned with here, but Mr. Saito writes, Costa, who is Putin's top finance guy and CEO of the second largest bank in Russia, is on board and has indicated he would finance Trump Moscow. This is major for us, not only the financing aspect, but Costa's position in Russia, extremely powerful and respected. A quote that sort of implies that there's a really rich and deep partnership between the Kremlin and this bank. I also was personally involved in the discussion of the lifting of sanctions on EN and Rusal, which involved Deripaska transferring 14% of his ownership in EN to VTB Bank. So there's just two facts that show what feels like a family relationship between the Kremlin, between banks and oligarchs. And so let me start with Mr. Connelly. I think this is your area of expertise. Can you just talk a little bit about how that relationship, Kremlin-controlled banks, but also banks that are maybe not Kremlin-controlled, with respect to providing financing for projects, providing support to oligarchs, and maybe even doing the service of the Kremlin, as is implied in Mr. Sater's letter here?
Thank you, Representative Himes. I'm actually not a Russia-specific financial expert, but my understanding is, as you laid out, that there's a very close connection in the way, for example, that Russian oligarchs are able to access financing from entities like Sberbank, from VTB, from VEB. But I'll defer to the other witnesses on the question of how specifically those causal mechanisms are working.
Ambassador, do you have a view?
Sure, I can talk about that. I know Mr. Costa. I know VTB. That was part of my job as the U.S. ambassador to help us understand those kind of activities. And I think it's important to understand that VTB is a completely controlled bank. I'm not even sure the word bank is the right word for it. That's part of, even the language I'm not sure we should be using. But we'd do whatever President Putin called them to do. Now, they had other aspirations long ago at VTB. And VTB Capital to expand in these other directions. They had other aspirations to privatize. I know that that was a plan that they had years ago. All those plans have been set aside, and so the thing you're quoting, that's very consistent. I don't know the specifics of that case, I want to be clear, but that it would be very consistent with the general way that I know that the Kremlin works with the three major banks.
Ms. Connelly, do you have a...
So, Congressman, our research has looked at how Russian influence manifests itself in Europe. So our expertise looks at, in some ways, how that Russian financing goes through European institutions. So, for one example, before the 2014 European Parliament elections, we saw where Russian finance went through the first Czech Russian bank, which is now defunct, to provide funds to Marine Le Pen's campaign prior to that election. We're also watching how Europeans, actually, this is both for Unicredit, Italy's largest bank, also Austria's banks, they're actually growing in size within Russia. And again, we didn't think we'd anticipate that 5 years after the annexation of Crimea, but actually European state-owned champions, energy and banking, are actually growing in their size, and that creates a risk to them. So that's my knowledge, comes from how the European banking structure is amplifying a lot of the Russian financing.
So I'm out of time, but very, very quick question. It sounds like one of the things we should do, and maybe other committees in this in the Congress should do, is investigate or at least propagate the idea that if you secure financing from a Russian entity, there may be strings attached. It could ultimately be used, and I'm looking at you, Mr. Hill, as a mechanism of compromise and therefore be a counterintelligence concern. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think your description of it being a family affair is good if you recognize the family as the Cosa Nostra. So it's like a mob relationship. It's not to say that all business contact with banks, I think, are false and are somehow suspect, but they could be compromised at any moment with that phone call from the Kremlin.
Ambassador.
Chairman, because I didn't mention Deripaska, you mentioned him. I would just say on that case, one I followed fairly closely, two things. One, when people say sanctions don't work, they most certainly worked with Mr. Deripaska. He lost billions of dollars, and allegedly, this is just in the reporting, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get off that sanctions list. So remember that. But number two, I think we need to understand how he did get off that sanctions list. You mentioned the restructuring that was done. This is very mysterious to me, why that was done, because it's always been my view, both as an academic and as a former policymaker, that sanctions are put in place to change the behavior of the target country that you're sanctioning. Putin has not changed his behavior, yet for some reason, the sanctions were lifted on Mr. Deripaska's firms. I think we should know more about exactly how that happened.
I agree. Thank you, Ambassador. I yield back.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just compliment you, first of all, for holding this hearing in the open so that the American people can begin to understand the threats that Russia has against our country. And let me also say that you showed extraordinary restraint with some of the viciousness that was exemplified by, regrettably, some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I also note, as does my colleague, that no one is here from the Republican side of the aisle. That's very unusual. Normally, there's always a representative of the Republican side of the aisle at hearings. I think it suggests a bit of stuntmanship that went on earlier. Let me also point out that the Barr letter specifically says that the Mueller report outlines the Russia efforts to influence the election. Clearly stated. Now, we don't have the underpinnings of that yet, but we should all wait to see that. The report by the Republican majority at the time said, and I quote, "The intelligence community assessment judgments on Putin's strategic intentions did not employ proper analytical tradecraft." So on the one hand, they will accept the Mueller report, but their own report suggested that it was inadequate. Let me just ask Ms. Connelly, thank you so much for your work. I'm curious about the Raiffeisen Bank in Austria. You spend a whole chapter on Austria and the banks. Could you express to us the relationship of Russia to the Raiffeisen Bank?
So again, it's a general pattern that we see, a close relationship that has been in the makings for decades. And this was in some ways Austria's very unique role in being, as they say, neither east nor west, neutral. And they were able to do quite a bit of trade. What we're seeing in the banking structures is really Austria's ability to amplify that Russian funding and take it elsewhere within Europe. So Austria is very powerfully placed their banking system across Central Europe, in the Western Balkans. And this is, to be honest with you, why we did the second research book, the Kremlin Playbook 2, is that we kept seeing Austrian firms, their banks and their energy firms repeatedly appearing throughout our first research. So we wanted to take a deeper dive in two types of banks. Raiffeisen Bank, because of its size and its great importance to the region, amplifies non-transparency, and Austria has very unique and special.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. The Raiffeisen Bank actually funded a Toronto Trump project for $300 million and never came back after that project went bankrupt to secure what it could in bankruptcy in terms of the return of their funds. Is that commonplace?
So, Congresswoman, we've studied how it works within Europe. We did not identify any specific structural arrangement outside of Europe.
Thank you. Ambassador, thank you again for your outstanding comments today. To what extent is Putin personally aware of Russian individuals who are engaged in money laundering in U.S. real estate?
I don't want to speculate. I don't know for sure. He most certainly wouldn't share that information with me personally. But knowing generally how the system works, I think he would be acutely aware of those kinds of things. He's a man of detail. I was always struck by that in my interactions with him when I was in the government, usually accompanying President Obama or other members of our administration. So I would, again, it would be very consistent that he would know about those things, but I don't know for sure. Maybe Steve knows.
Mr. Hall?
I think that the term acutely aware, that's a good term. Yeah, anything that's of critical importance to him in splitting the West and splitting the United States and dividing us, he would take a great interest in.
So if a number of LLCs are created that are based in which ownership of the real estate in the United States is by Russians, there is potentially a likelihood that Putin knows about it.
There certainly could be,
All right.
it would stand to reason, yes.
Would Putin ever authorize an oligarch to purchase a U.S. property at an inflated price as compromat, Mr. Ambassador?
I know the case you're talking about, and I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. We should get our intelligence community to help you get the answer to that question. I personally don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Hall?
That would be consistent with how the Russian intelligence services function.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Are there any further questions from my colleagues? Yes, Ms.
Can I ask just one last question? I think the comments that many of you made about the porousness of our election system and the Russian ability to not only get into the voting rolls, but conceivably into the voting machines, is something that the American people really care about. And yet it has not gotten the attention it deserves. We have 4 companies that basically have a lock on all the voting machines in this country. There's no requirement for audits, for paper ballots, for the kind of optical scanning. Do any of you have confidence that the Russians would not, maybe I'm saying this wrong, knowing that and the vulnerabilities, is that something that clearly the Russians would take full advantage of if they could?
Yes, they absolutely would. And in fairness to those companies and others who are trying to do these protective measures, which are important defensively, we have to understand that the way our open society is set up and the way that the internet functions, it's designed to share information as efficiently as possible. So this is a real struggle when you're trying to protect really critical information. Having worked in an organization that really wants to protect its information, it's a really hard thing to do when you're talking about systems that are designed to share. How you get around that is how you defend against that is a really difficult thing, but I don't think you can do it unless you also have that offensive thing that we were talking about before, letting the Russians know, look, we're going to defend, but if we catch you, the price you're going to pay is brutal. That 1-2 thing is the only thing I think we can do.
Well, Congressman, I think looking at what Europe has done, it's the redundancy of the paper ballot that is absolutely essential because, and in fact, in many European countries, they still, I mean, it seems so archaic to what we should be doing in the fantastic technologies we have, but they do require that redundancy of paper just to make sure, again, it's about ensuring confidence that every vote is there. So I think there could be some redundancy very helpfully to that process.
And if I could just add to that, if I may, absolutely paper trail for every ballot. That seems like a complete no-brainer, and that we haven't done that yet is shocking to me. But I also want to remind you that there are a lot of other actors copying the Putin playbook now, including domestic actors, and we need to be aware of the fact that we could have multiple actors trying to disrupt our elections in 2020, and that's why I think it's so vital that we focus on these prescriptive measures now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for accommodating me.
I thank you. And Ambassador, on that point, one of the issues that our committee is investigating is the development of the deepfake technology. My paramount concern during 2016, as we were watching what the Russians were doing in real time, the hacking and the dumping of these documents, is that they were going to begin dumping forgeries among the real. That concern now is heightened exponentially, given that this new technology would allow the Russians or any other foreign actor or any other malicious domestic actor to push out in proximity to an election video or audio which is completely a forged product. but nonetheless has all the indicia of veracity and reliability. When we consider just how disruptive that would be, the Russians don't need to hack our elections infrastructure, although it is all too vulnerable. Pushing out that kind of false content could be far more influential. And we're in a race right now of technologies, the technology to develop deepfakes and the technology to detect them. And I'm deeply concerned, given just how polarized the country is, the electorate is, indeed our committee is, that our ability to respond to that is very much in doubt. And psychologists will tell you, once you have seen a video, even if you're later persuaded intellectually that the video is a fake, you cannot undo the impression and the lingering impact of that. So we're entering a brave new world, and what we need is a whole-of-government approach that looks at what each and every agency is doing to protect the country and to protect the integrity of our democratic institutions, that is working collaboratively, that is talking to each other. We need the public to be more critical of what they learn on social media, and this needs to be a comprehensive effort. Your testimony today has been very, very helpful in informing us of the task ahead. And I want to thank you for appearing today, and more than that, I want to thank you for your service to the country. We are adjourned.